man in the fog appeared 3 times on an empty stretch of Highway 101. And by the third time, he was standing directly in the middle of the road waiting for me. It was 2022, back when I still lived in Oakland, and I made the drive north to visit my parents in Eureka for the weekend. If you've never driven Highway 101 along Northern California's coastline at night, count yourself lucky. During the day, it's breathtaking. Towering redwoods, cliffs hanging over the ocean, endless forests swallowed in mist. But after dark, that highway feels abandoned by God. No estretrites, no signal, no other cars for miles. Just black forest pressing against both sides of the road like it's alive. I left my parents' house around 8 p.m. on a Sunday, already exhausted before the drive even started. In hindsight, it was a terrible decision. I should have stayed the night, but I had an early shift the next morning and convinced myself I could power through the 6-hour drive back south. For the first 2 hours, everything was normal. Then somewhere near Trinidad, the fog rolled in. And when I say fog, I don't mean the light coastal mist California gets sometimes. I mean a wall. 1 second the road was clear, and 5 minutes later my headlights looked like they were shining into wet cement. Visibility dropped so hard I could barely see 20 feet ahead of the hood. I slowed to 35. The smart thing would have been pulling over, but there's almost nowhere safe to stop out there. Just trees, cliffs, and narrow shoulders disappearing into darkness. So I kept driving. That was mistake number 1. The strange thing about fog that thick is how quickly it destroys your sense of reality. Time stretches. Distances stop making sense. Every curve feels identical to the last. You begin to feel trapped inside the road instead of driving on it. And the silence. God, the silence. No radio signal. No passing cars. Nothing except the sound of my tires cutting through wet pavement. After maybe 30 minutes of white-knuckle driving, my headlights caught something standing on the shoulder ahead. At first, I thought it was a signpost. Then it moved slightly. A person, tall, thin, standing perfectly still at the edge of the highway. As I got closer, I realized the man wasn't waving for help. He wasn't holding a phone. He wasn't even looking around. He was just facing the road, waiting. I slowed instinctively, terrified he'd suddenly step in front of the car. But he never moved an inch, not even when I passed within a few feet of him. And the creepiest part? He never turned his head to watch me go by. Most people out there would flag someone down immediately, especially at night, especially in weather like that. But this guy stood there motionless like he'd been planted beside the road. I checked my mirrors for taillights or a stranded vehicle. Nothing. No broken down car. No emergency flashers. No signs anyone else existed out there. My gut screamed at me to keep driving, so I did. 10 minutes later, I saw him again. Same height, same dark clothes, same unnatural stillness. Only this time, he was standing on the opposite side of the highway. I actually felt my stomach drop. There was no possible way this guy could have gotten ahead of me. I hadn't passed a single intersection, side road, or car the entire time. There was nowhere he could have come from. Yet there he was, waiting again. I didn't want to look at him this time, but I did. And the second my headlights hit his face, his head snapped toward me with terrifying speed. Our eyes locked. I swear to God, I felt ice shoot through my entire body. Not fear, not panic, something deeper. The feeling that I had just acknowledged something I wasn't supposed to see. I hit the gas immediately, pushing close to 50 despite the fog. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it over the engine. Every instinct told me to get as far away from that thing as possible. But the fog only got thicker. Soon I could barely see the yellow center lines beneath me. The world outside my windshield had vanished completely. It felt less like driving through fog and more like sinking underwater. Then, maybe 3 minutes later, my headlights illuminated another figure ahead, standing directly in the middle of the road. I slammed the brakes. The tires skidded against wet pavement before the car jerked to a stop just feet away from him. This time the man wore a hood pulled low over his face. But somehow, I knew it was him. He didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't react to the headlights blinding him. He just stood there in absolute silence while my engine idled between us. And then slowly, very slowly, he started walking toward my driver's side door. Even without seeing his face, I could feel him staring directly at me, through the windshield. Not just looking at me, studying me. The kind of stare that makes your entire body lock up before your brain even understands why. My hands tightened around the steering wheel so hard my fingers started hurting. For a second, I completely froze. The hooded figure stood motionless in the middle of Highway 101 while dense fog swirled around him like smoke on a battlefield. I flashed my high beams repeatedly. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. No reaction. No movement. No sign that he was even human. That's when survival instinct finally kicked in. I threw the car into reverse. The backup lights illuminated the road behind me, and my blood instantly turned to ice. There was another person back there, moving slowly toward my car. Not running, not waving, just advancing through the fog with this horrible calmness, like he already knew there was nowhere I could go. Holy shit, I screamed out loud. I slammed the car back into drive, so hard the transmission jerked. My brain stopped thinking rationally at that point. All that mattered was getting out alive. I was trapped between them, one in front, one behind, like an ambush. I yanked the wheel hard right, crossing partially into the opposite lane to squeeze around the hooded figure blocking the road. My headlights swept across him as I passed, and for one horrifying second, I realized he still hadn't moved. Not even an inch. Then it happened. Boom! Something smashed into the back of my car with unbelievable force. The impact was violent enough to throw the entire rear in sideways. Metal shrieked against metal with this deafening crunch that echoed through the fog like a car wreck in a war zone. I fought the steering wheel to keep control. My tires slipped on the wet pavement before finally gripping again, and somehow I kept the car from spinning out into the trees. My first thought was that another vehicle had rear-ended me, but when I looked in the mirror, there was nothing there. No headlights, no car, no people, nothing except thick white fog swallowing the empty highway behind me. That was the moment real panic hit me, because an accident leaves evidence. Sound, lights, movement. But the road behind me looked untouched, like whatever hit my car had vanished the second it made contact. I pushed the accelerator harder. At that point, I didn't care about speeding, road conditions, or visibility. I just needed distance between myself and whatever the hell had happened back there. The fog stayed heavy for miles, turning the highway into a tunnel of white static. Every shadow looked alive. Every road sign made me jump. Then eventually, near the 101 interchange, the fog suddenly started thinning. Little by little, the world came back. Trees, guardrails, lane markings, normal reality. And for the first time in almost an hour, I could breathe again. As my adrenaline slowly wore off, logic started fighting its way back into my head. I'd been driving nearly 4 straight hours. I was exhausted, alone, sleep-deprived, locked in an endless fog on an empty road. So I started convincing myself none of it had been real. Maybe I hallucinated the figures. People do hallucinate under stress and exhaustion, especially driving at night. Maybe my brain filled shapes into the fog and panic did the rest. Even the impact, I figured maybe I clipped a guardrail or slammed into a mile marker without realizing it. Honestly, that explanation comforted me because the alternative was worse. Way worse. By the time I got home, I just wanted sleep. I parked in my driveway, grabbed my bag, and tried forcing the entire experience out of my mind. Then I walked behind a car and stopped cold. The rear bumper was destroyed. Not scratched, not lightly dented. Destroyed. A massive dent stretched nearly the full width of the bumper, like something heavy had slammed into it at high speed. I remember just standing there staring at it in complete silence while my stomach slowly dropped, because that damage meant one thing for certain. Something had actually hit me, which meant I hadn't imagined everything. What made it even stranger was the lack of paint transfer. If another car had rear-ended me, there should have been scratches, chipped paint, broken plastic, something. There was nothing, just crushed metal. I eventually called the police, mostly so there'd at least be a report on record in case someone else experienced something similar out there. But even now, for years later, I still think about that night constantly. I've replayed every second of it in my head more times than I can count. The explanation I've settled on is this. I probably hallucinated the people, but accidentally hit some kind of roadside object while swerving away in panic. That's the version I tell myself, because it's the only version that allows me to sleep. But the trail cuts through a small patch of forest for about a quarter mile before looping back out onto the street only a block from my house. I'd run that route so many times between freshman and senior year that it was basically burned into my brain. Every turn, every hill, every root sticking out of the dirt. Honestly, the woods were always my favorite part. Running on pavement destroys your knees after a while, but the trail was softer, quieter, calmer. When you're running, silence becomes addictive. No traffic, no people, just your breathing and the sound of your feet hitting the ground. So around 5 p.m., I headed out for the run. The sun still had a couple hours before setting, so darkness wasn't a concern. What I did notice immediately, though, the second I stepped outside, was the fog. And not normal fog. This stuff looked unnatural. I'd lived in that town my entire life, and I had never seen fog like that before. It hung in the air so thick it almost looked artificial, like one of those surreal lo-fi videos online where everything's washed out and dreamlike. Anything beyond 30 feet completely disappeared into white haze. Houses looked blurred. Trees looked stretched. Even sound felt muted somehow. I actually considered skipping the run altogether, but I talked myself out of it. The trail was simple. One straight path through the woods with no forks, no side routes. No way to get lost unless you intentionally wandered off into the brush. I had my Garmin watch on tracking distance and pace anyway, so I figured I was fine. At least, that's what I thought. I started the workout, jogged the quarter mile through the neighborhood, and entered the woods. The fog got worse instantly. The trees blocked most of the remaining daylight, and the deeper I went, the darker everything became. Visibility dropped to maybe 15 feet at most. Still, the trail itself was easy enough to follow. For the first mile and a half, nothing felt wrong. I was running slower than usual because I didn't want to trip over roots or slide off the path, but otherwise everything seemed normal. I checked my watch around the 1 mile mark, then again around 1.5. No issues. The problem started around mile 2.5. At that point in the loop, I should have been approaching the exit of the trail. There's a section where the dirt path curves left, climbs a small hill, and spits you right back on a pavement. I knew that section by heart. Hell, I knew the entire route by heart. So when I glanced down at my watch and saw 2.5 miles while still surrounded by trees, my first reaction was annoyance, not fear. I assumed my GPS was glitching. The watch was old, 4 years at least, and dense tree coverage can mess with signal tracking. Add the fog on top of that, and it seemed like a perfectly reasonable explanation. So I kept running. But then I crossed 3 miles, and that's when my stomach tightened, because 3 miles was the entire loop. At 3 miles, I should have been back home already. Instead, I was still deep inside the woods. Same dirt trail, same trees, same endless fog swallowing everything ahead of me. No exit, no road, nothing. I slowed to a stop. At this point, I wasn't scared yet. Confused, definitely. Frustrated too. But my brain kept trying to force a logical explanation onto the situation. Maybe I'd somehow zoned out and missed the curve. Maybe I accidentally took a side path without noticing. Except there weren't any side paths. That was the problem. There was only one trail. No forks, no branches, no alternate directions. The only way to get lost would have been physically stepping off the path and wandering into the woods, which I knew for a fact I hadn't done. I checked my watch again. 3.1 miles, then 3.2. The distance kept increasing even though I was standing completely still. That was the first moment genuine unease crept into my chest. The GPS was definitely malfunctioning, but that still didn't explain why I hadn't reached the end of the trail. I realized I had 2 choices. Keep moving forward and hope I eventually found the exit, or turn around and retrace my steps. Turning back seemed smarter. If I reversed course, I'd eventually hit the trail entrance where I started. From there, getting home would be easy. So that's exactly what I did. I turned around and started running back the way I came. By then, the fog had somehow become even thicker. I don't even know how that's possible, but visibility had dropped so badly I had to slow to almost a jog walk just to stay centered on the trail. The woods felt different now, heavier, like the silence itself was pressing down on me. After maybe another mile, 4 total at that point, I heard something. And the second I heard it, every instinct in my body went off like an alarm. Because woods that small are usually dead quiet. Too small for large animals. Too close to neighborhoods for anything dangerous. You might hear birds sometimes, or branches moving in the wind, but that's it. This sound was nothing like that. It started low, deep, almost like a distant moan. But moan isn't really the right word. It sounded mechanical and human at the same time. A long droning noise that rose and fell slowly in pitch, like an air raid siren trying to imitate a human voice. The sound echoed through the fog and waves, growing louder, then quieter, then louder again. Every single time it swelled, my chest tightened harder, because there was something deeply wrong about it. It didn't sound like someone calling for help. It didn't sound injured either. It sounded intentional, like something in those woods was announcing itself. The sound kept going. That low, wavering drone echoed through the woods without rhythm or purpose, like something breathing through a broken machine. I started running faster, but by that point, I'd already logged over 4 miles and my legs were beginning to fail me. Every step felt heavier. My lungs burned. My chest tightened with exhaustion. And somehow, that made everything worse. Because the more tired I got, the more terrified I became. I could hear the sound moving with me. Not behind me, not ahead of me, with me. No matter how much I pushed myself, it stayed at the same distance, swelling and fading through the fog like it was pacing me deliberately. I kept glancing over my shoulder. Again, and again, and again. Every single time, there was nothing there. Just endless white fog swallowing the trail. No footsteps. No silhouette, nothing visible at all, but the sound never stopped. At that point, survival instinct completely took over. I wasn't jogging anymore, I was fleeing. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, branches whipping past me through the haze while my pulse hammered in my ears like gunfire. The woods no longer felt familiar. They felt hostile, like I had crossed into something alive. Minutes stretched forever. My legs were shaking so badly, I thought I was going to collapse right there on the trail. Every breath tore through my throat. Then finally, I saw pavement. I burst out of the woods and stumbled into the street, nearly falling to my knees from exhaustion. I bent over with my hands on my thighs, trying not to throw up while cold air burned through my lungs. The fog outside the woods was still impossibly thick. Streetlights looked blurred and distorted. Houses appeared like faded outlines underwater. But none of that mattered, because when I turned back toward the trail entrance, something was standing there, right in the middle of the path. Not far inside the woods either. Close enough that I should have been able to tell what it was. But I couldn't. Even now, I still can't explain what I saw. It wasn't a person. At least, it didn't look like one. It was more like a shape. A massive black silhouette standing motionless between the trees. The thing was unbelievably tall, easily 7 feet, maybe more, and unnaturally thin. I am Sheshchiyedens. This thing towered over me. At first I thought maybe it was a tree trunk distorted by the fog. Then it moved. Not walking, not stepping closer, just slowly swaying side to side, almost gently, like something hanging underwater. And even from that distance, I could feel it watching me. That's the only way I know how to describe it. I felt observed, locked onto. The droning noise had completely stopped by then, but honestly, I didn't care anymore. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get away from that trail immediately. So I ran. I turned and sprinted home without looking back once. That happened a few weeks ago. I'm back at school now, trying to focus on classes and graduation, but I still think about that night constantly. Sometimes I'll be sitting in a lecture or lying in bed, and that image suddenly comes back into my head. That towering black shape standing motionless in the fog. And that sound. God, that sound. I told my parents what happened, obviously. Both of them tried convincing me it was probably just some tall guy messing with me, or maybe someone trying to scare me off the trail. And logically, I understand why they'd think that, but I don't believe it, because no person could have made that noise while running at the same pace as me. And no normal person was that tall. I don't know what was in those woods that night. And a part of me is terrified that someday I'll find out. Music. This happened about 6 years ago, near the end of September. My friend Edwin and I had been planning a kayaking trip through Willapa Bay for almost 2 years before we finally made it happen. If you've never seen the area, Willapa Bay is massive, around 25 miles across in some sections. It's mostly oyster farms, marshland, and wildlife refuge along the coast of Washington. On clear days, it's one of the calmest places you'll ever experience. The weekend we chose was not a clear day. That detail matters, because what happened out there had nothing to do with inexperience. Edwin and I weren't amateurs. We'd both been kayaking since childhood, and Edwin had even worked as a guide during college summers. We knew tides, navigation, weather patterns, all of it. So when I tell this story, understand this. We weren't panicking tourists getting spooked by ordinary fog. We launched early Saturday morning near Nakata. The fog was already thick when we unloaded the kayaks, but coastal fog usually burns off by mid-morning, so neither of us considered it dangerous. We had GPS, compasses, emergency gear, everything we needed. The plan was simple. Paddle toward Long Island. Watch bird for a while. Have lunch on one of the sandbars. Head back before the afternoon tide shifted. Easy trip. For the first hour, everything felt normal. The fog muffled the entire bay in that strange way coastal fog always does. Sound became dull and distant, like we were paddling through layers of wet cotton. We couldn't see more than 40 feet in any direction, but we stayed close together and checked our bearings every few minutes. No problem. Then around 9 a.m., I heard something, a splash. At first I assumed it was Edwin adjusting his stroke. He was paddling maybe 15 feet off my left side, slightly behind me. But when I looked over, his paddle was resting across his kayak. He looked at me immediately and said, "You heard that too, right?" I nodded. We both stopped paddling. The kayaks drifted silently while we listened. Another splash. Slow, rhythmic, and instantly, both of us realized the same thing. Those weren't paddles. They were oars. There's a huge difference in sound between paddles and oars when you spend enough time on the water. Paddles cut quickly and lightly. Oars drag deeper, heavier, and whatever we were hearing sounded like someone rowing a boat somewhere off to our right. Not far away either, maybe 100 feet. Edwin shrugged and said it was probably another group out on the bay, which honestly made sense. Fishermen came through the area, sometimes checking crab pots, and there were occasionally other kayakers too. The fog was thick enough that we wouldn't necessarily see them. Sound behaves strangely over water, especially in heavy fog. Sometimes noises seem miles away when they're close. Other times they sound right beside you. So we waited quietly, expecting the boat to eventually emerge through the mist. But it never did. We waited for whoever was out there to either call back to us or emerge from the fog. That's basic water etiquette. When visibility is bad, you announce yourself. You let nearby boats know where you are so nobody collides in blind water. But this boat never did. The rowing just continued. Slow, steady, perfectly rhythmic. Like whoever was rowing didn't care we existed. I suggested maybe they simply hadn't heard us over the water. So Edwin cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted into the fog. Hey, no answer, not even a pause. The oars kept moving at the exact same pace, dipping into the water with this calm, mechanical rhythm that somehow felt worse than if the person had shouted back. We exchanged a look and started paddling again, assuming we'd eventually cross paths. But after 20 minutes, something about the situation became impossible to ignore. The sound never changed distance. Not once. No matter how we adjusted our course or speed, the rowing stayed locked beside us at the exact same point somewhere off to our right. Never closer, never farther. Just there. At first, it was almost mesmerizing. The consistency of it. Stroke after stroke after stroke. Perfectly timed without a single interruption. No hositaschen. No change in tempo. It sounded less like a person rowing and more like a machine repeating the same movement endlessly. Eventually, the repetition started getting inside my head. It became hypnotic and then terrifying. Edwin barely spoke anymore, and neither did I. The atmosphere had changed completely. The bay no longer felt peaceful. It felt watched. At one point, we angled slightly east toward shore, hoping to get our bearings better. And for maybe 3 seconds, the fog thinned enough for me to finally see it. A small rowboat, dark colored, old looking, and someone sitting at the oars. I couldn't make out details, no face, no clothing, but I saw the silhouette clearly enough to know there was definitely a person inside the boat. Then the fog swallowed it again. Gone. The entire glimpse lasted seconds. Did you see that? I asked immediately. Edwin nodded without taking his eyes off the water. That was when I decided I wanted out. Nothing openly threatening had happened. No weapons, no shouting, no direct confrontation. But the entire situation felt deeply wrong in a way I can't fully explain even now. It was just some stranger rowing through heavy fog. Yet every instinct I had kept screaming that we shouldn't be near them. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the way they ignored us completely. Or maybe it was because deep down, both of us realized something impossible was happening. That boat was following us. I started paddling towards shore immediately. And after a second, Edwin followed. The problem was navigating. Even with GPS, moving through Willapa Bay in thick fog is dangerous. Sandbars shift constantly with the tides. Shallow channels can strand you in mud flats. And landmarks disappear completely when visibility drops. We knew roughly where land should have been. But roughly feels terrifying when you can't see more than 40 feet in front of you. Especially when another boat is pacing you unseen through the fog. We paddled southeast as fast as we could without burning ourselves out. And the rowing sound stayed beside us the entire time. Every few seconds I'd glance right, expecting the fog to part again and reveal that boat floating there beside us. But I never saw it again, only heard it. Stroke, splash, stroke, splash. Then suddenly, the fog started lifting. Not completely, but enough that visibility expanded from 40 feet to maybe 100 yards almost all at once. Instantly, I looked right toward where the rowing had been coming from. Nothing, just open water. I spun around looking in every direction. No rowboat, no fisherman, no kayak, nothing anywhere on the bay except Edwin and me. I saw him doing the same thing, turning in circles, scanning the water with this horrified expression I'll never forget. Because somehow, the sound had vanished with the fog, and there was nowhere that boat could have gone. The shoreline finally emerged ahead of us a few minutes later, and I remember feeling genuine relief for the first time all morning. I thought once our feet touched land, whatever weirdness we'd experienced would finally be over. I was wrong. We paddled straight into the shallows without even searching for a proper landing spot. The second my kayak scraped bottom, I jumped out into knee-deep water. The cold hit like knives, but I barely noticed. I just wanted solid ground beneath me. For a minute or two, neither of us said much. We stood there catching our breath while the fog slowly peeled away from the bay behind us. Still no boats. Not a single one. Edwin eventually wandered farther up the beach while I secured the kayaks. Then I heard him call my name. Not loudly, but urgently. I walked over to him, and the moment I saw what he was staring at, every bit of fear came flooding back. Footprints. Bara footprints. Wet ones, leading directly out of the water. The tracks were fresh, so fresh you could still see water pooling slowly into the impressions left in the sand. Whoever made them had stepped on ashore only moments earlier. But the terrifying part wasn't the footprints themselves. It was where they led. The tracks emerged from the bay several yards down the shoreline, walked calmly up onto the beach, then continued directly past the exact place where Edwin and I had landed. Like whoever made them had been watching us arrive. The footprints continued along the shoreline for a short distance before suddenly turning toward the trees, toward the woods, and disappearing into them. I followed the trail backward with my eyes, trying to understand what I was seeing. There were no other footprints, no signs of another boat, no drag marks in the sand, just a single set of barefoot tracks coming silently out of the freezing bay. The footprints disappeared into the forest. Edwin was already a few steps ahead of me, clearly ready to get back into the kayaks and leave the entire situation behind. But I couldn't stop staring at those tracks. Something about them bothered me on a level I still can't explain. They weren't random. They meant something. Those footprints had come from somewhere, and I needed to know where. Edwin kept saying we should leave, but I told him I wanted to follow the tracks, not into the woods, but back the other direction toward the shoreline. I wanted answers, even if they were bad ones. He looked at me like I'd completely lost my mind. Honestly, maybe I had. But ever since we first heard those oars moving through the fog, this feeling had been building in my chest. That horrible sense that something wasn't right out there on the bay. And I couldn't just paddle away pretending none of it happened. Edwin argued for maybe 30 seconds before finally giving in. He didn't want to investigate, but he also clearly didn't want to stand alone on that beach either. So we followed the footprints. The fog had thinned enough by then that visibility was better, though everything still looked pale and washed out beneath the gray sky. We walked for maybe 2 or 3 minutes along the shoreline, keeping the wet tracks beside us in the sand. Then I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, half pulled onto the beach at an angle, sat a small wooden rowboat. And the second I laid eyes on it, every hair on my body stood up. The wood was dark, almost black from moisture and age, and the oars rested silently inside it. It was the same boat, no doubt in my mind. Same shape, same size, same narrow frame I'd glimpsed drifting through the fog beside us out on the bay. Except now, it was sitting abandoned on the shore with fresh footprints leading away from it. For a second, curiosity overpowered fear. I actually started walking toward the boat. Then Edwin grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "We're leaving," he said. Not nervous, not uncertain, dead serious. And the way he said it scared me more than the boat itself. He told me he didn't care who had been rowing it, didn't care where they'd gone, didn't care what explanation I thought we might find. We were done. Something about the panic in his voice snapped me back to reality. Because he was right. Whoever had been in that rowboat had somehow reached shore before us, in a slower vessel. Then they'd walked all the way down the beach to the exact location where we happened to land, before disappearing into the trees. None of that should have been possible. Not with the distance we'd traveled, not with the timing, not with the fog. And suddenly the entire beach no longer felt empty. It felt occupied, like we were standing inside someone else's territory. We turned immediately and headed back toward the kayaks. At that point, Edwin was practically jogging through the sand, and seeing him panic made my own fear spike even harder. Edwin was the calmest outdoorsman I knew, the kind of guy who stayed level-headed through storms, equipment failures, anything. Seeing him genuinely scared shook me badly. We reached the kayaks, shoved them into the water, and paddled away from that shoreline as fast as we could. Neither of us looked back, and that was the end of it, at least physically. Mentally, I still think about that morning all the time, even 6 years later. I replayed every detail over and over in my head, trying to force a rational explanation onto it. The best case scenario is that someone was messing with us, some elaborate prank. But even that falls apart the more I think about it. Because here's what I keep coming back to. We were out on the bay for over 2 hours. We changed directions multiple times, drifted with currents, altered course repeatedly before finally making a direct push for shore once the fog started lifting. Whoever was rowing that boat would have needed to somehow predict exactly where we were going to land, beat us there in a slower craft, walk the shoreline ahead of us, and disappear into the woods before we even stepped onto the beach. Every time I think about the logistics of it, the story feels less possible, not more. And honestly, that's the part that still bothers me the most. Not the fog, not the footprints, not even the boat. It's the feeling that something was out there with us the entire time, close enough to hear breathing through the mist. And we never truly saw it.